Hi, my name is Bijal Shah and I am a bibliotherapist and founder of Book Therapy, a bibliotherapy and literary curation practice. I'm also the author of the book Bibliotherapy, The Healing Power of Reading. I curate book prescriptions and provide online training in bibliotherapy. More detail of this can be found on my website, www.booktherapy.io. In this podcast, I share my knowledge and research on bibliotherapy, including the latest developments, science, and book recommendations. Join me every week where we take a deep dive into bibliotherapy. We release 2 episodes a week. Voice notes from me, your resident bibliotherapist, and Ask the Bibliotherapist, book recommendations for what's on your mind. I hope you enjoy the show, and if you'd like a bibliotherapist in your pocket, you might find my book, Bibliotherapy, The Healing Power of Reading, a helpful companion. It's available at any bookstore that you shop at. And don't forget to subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts and get new episodes as they're released. And as always, I love hearing from listeners. So if you'd like to get in touch, share any book recommendations or thoughts on bibliotherapy, you can do so at bijal@booktherapy.io. Thanks for listening. Hi everyone, welcome back to Bibliotherapy with Bijal Shah. I'm so excited to share my conversation with Daisy Fancourt today. Daisy is the author of the new book, Art Cure, which is now available at bookstores everywhere. And it's a wonderful celebration of the effects of art on our mental health and well-being. Daisy is a professor of psychobiology and epidemiology at University College London, where she heads the Social Biobehavioral Research Group and is the director of the World Health Organization Collaborating Center on Arts and Health. She has published 300 scientific papers and won over 24 academic prizes. She is a multi-award-winning science communicator and has been named a World Economic Forum, Global Shaper, and BBC New Generation Thinker. Daisy is listed as one of the most highly cited scientists in the world. So without further ado, here's our conversation. I hope you enjoy every minute of it. Hi Daisy, it's so lovely to have you here today, and I'm so excited about your book, Art Cure, which is out tomorrow, Thursday, the 8th of January. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah. And thank you so much for having me on your show.
The episode might release a little bit after that, but we're chatting with the imminent launch, and I understand that it's already out at many of the bookstores across the UK currently. Is that correct?
That's right. I'm very happy to say it's been named Book of the Month from every major UK retailer. So it is available in everyone's chain stores and also in so many independent shops as well.
Oh, that's brilliant. I can only imagine the excitement across booksellers as well, because it's such a book lover's book. For me, this book really resonated because it's so aligned to bibliotherapy, and I really felt that my listeners and readers and followers would be absolutely super excited about this. I'd love to tell my listeners a little bit about you and your journey and how you came to writing this book, because this book is only a small part of what you actually do. There's so much context behind what you do, and it feels like the book's been a long time in the making. So it would be great to share briefly a little bit about yourself and what you do and how you came across the subject matter and what inspired you to go ahead and write this book. That would be wonderful to hear a little bit more about that.
So I'm a professor of psychobiology and epidemiology at University College London. So I'm a scientist that studies how engagement in the arts affects our minds, brains, bodies, behaviour, essentially all aspects of our health. I actually started off in the arts. I was a professional pianist. I did an arts undergraduate degree. But I think like many people who love arts, I also loved science and medicine, and I couldn't really pick between the two. So I got this amazing first job working in hospitals, designing arts programmes. I worked at Chelsea and Westminster Hospital in London for several years, and I got to see firsthand the incredible effect that the arts have on people's health, whether they're in hospital for a whole range of different conditions. But it really got me so interested in why was this happening? What was the science behind this? So I then left the NHS to retrain in science and do new degrees. And that's how I've now come to have this amazing job where I get to discover new impacts that the arts have on us every day.
Wow, what a journey. So from a pianist to designing art programs in the NHS and then studying science and in so much depth. And obviously, I think you've done a PhD as well. I totally resonate when you said that you like all the sciencey bits, but then also like the artsy stuff, because I actually did a maths degree and then ended up going into psychology and literature and writing. So that definitely resonates with me.
People don't really appreciate how similar arts and science are. I mean, they're both about creativity and curiosity at the
Yeah.
heart, aren't they?
I 100% agree. I think to succeed in science, you do need to have that creative mind and designing the experiments, designing the thought process, exploration. So it's nice that you're able to bring this together. And of course, what's really exciting for me is the effect and impact on art on our well-being. The title of your book reframes the arts as the fifth pillar of health alongside diet, sleep, exercise, and nature. And I think it's really important to point that out because it's so distinct from the other pillars, something that can influence our brains to such a level that it's obviously triggering a point of therapeutic healing. So it's interesting how you framed it as this fifth pillar. I'd like to understand your thought process behind that.
Well, I feel people generally are increasingly aware of behaviours that they can do that support their health. And we've heard so much about things like exercise, about diet, about sleep, about nature. But that's really why I wanted to write this book, because working in this field as a scientist, I'm aware of this phenomenal literature, so many studies, tens of thousands of them. But when I tell people about the work I do looking at the health benefits of the arts, many of my friends and family are really unaware of how deep this scientific literature is. And that's why I felt like actually having a book that positions the arts in the same way we've got used to thinking about those other health behaviours could be really powerful here. The effects are actually very similar that we see from those other health behaviours, including the size, the magnitude of the effects. But I think there's a lot to be done about raising the public awareness. Now, probably not for your listeners who are already very involved in this, but I think amongst other people there, it's really helpful if we can start having these discussions more openly.
Yes, absolutely. And just drawing in the arts and the culture as a possibility, because I think sometimes people just don't think about it, right? I read somewhere that the book actually began as a research paper.
Actually, a report that I wrote for the World Health Organization.
Yes, that's correct.
Initially, it was anticipated that the report might be a kind of small scale thing for them to think about. But the report has now been downloaded 250,000 times. It's become the most downloaded evidence report from WHO Europe. So this is actually highlighted. This is not a niche thing. It's something that is really captivating people's interest. But that was a kind of academic policy report. And that's why I thought actually having a much more popular book that explains the science, but also brings in real life stories from people, from artists, that could be a really nice way of making this have greater general awareness.
Yes, that's right. And I think people like to see it represented as a story, as anecdotes, to see how it's practically working as well beyond the scientific experimentation. That's great to hear. So I assume the books have got a lot of these client stories, and you mentioned you've designed art programs for the NHS. I assume that all of that detail is in there.
Very much so. And I've tried to make sure that every chapter, as well as having science, as well as having stories that bring it to life, it also has very practical takeaways so that readers understand how they can then use the science to change their own arts behaviours or to use the arts to try and support specific aspects of their mental or physical health.
Oh, that's wonderful. And is there anything in particular that everybody could do that's quite universal as a starting point?
Absolutely. In fact, in the closing chapters of the book, I talk about some of the things I think we might be doing wrong in society, which is often about devaluing arts. In the US, for example, 95% of people would say they didn't do any arts at all yesterday.
Really?
And I think we do have big issues. We see a similar thing for reading. We found that, again, looking at US adults, only 1 in 7 adults would say they read a book for pleasure yesterday. I talk a lot about what these behavioural patterns are, but then why this might be. Some of it, I think, is about us and societies not valuing the arts enough, not valuing artists. Some of it is us having blocks ourselves, that barriers to engaging. And I give really clear practical takeaways about how you can address each barrier you might be facing, and some sort of general tips as well as the specific tips in each chapter, like thinking about arts, how we might think about food. So thinking about how can we get our 5 a day of vegetables? Well, what's our equivalent for the arts to make sure that we do something every day and we make the space for it?
Yes, exactly. And I think our biggest competitor is probably social media. I mean, would you say some of that is art?
The definition that I use in the book is I point out that arts activities are things that contain creativity, imagination, multisensory stimulation. And so I think sometimes with social media, often it's not that. Often we're all guilty of going onto social media and using it to just scroll through or to post things about our own lives without it necessarily being creative. But we can certainly use social media in a creative way. We can think about the amazing little videos and things that you get showing you how to craft, or giving you those tips that can get you started in creative activities. That's often us being creative rather than seeing social media as something that's creative.
What are the different art forms that you cover? Because obviously music, there's dance,
literature and stories too. And I also look at the role of stories in the context of dramas, whether that's on the stage or on television or in the cinema. I try to break down the idea that arts is something that's highbrow by talking about all kinds of art forms. So including things like circus arts and magic tricks, like street art, like tattooing, beading, origami, thinking about carnivals and festivals. And also some of those things that actually contain very similar ingredients to the arts, like baking, for example, which can very much be a creative artistic pursuit, and horticultural arts like flower arranging, which is very similar to other kinds of arts activities too, even if we sometimes don't categorize it the same way in our minds.
Yes, exactly. So in bibliotherapy, for example, we talk about reading and enjoying the book and using the book as a prompt. But then there's also the writing piece of it. So it's the doing as well, which is very much part of the therapeutic process.
I
It's
talk
that
about some of those situations where you'll get benefits just from more passively receiving things. So, like reading books, like listening to music, versus when there can be particular health outcomes where you need to put more in yourself. You have to be the one that's doing that creative production yourself if you want to experience extra health benefits.
And what would you say is the science behind it? Is it the effect on our brains? Is it the dopamine effects? Is it the hormones? Quite curious what your research might have shown.
I cover everything. So we start with the mind, so thinking about mental health and well-being. We then go into the brain, so thinking about neuroplasticity, about dopamine response, for example, about cognitive reserve, so the arts helping to build the resilience of our brain against cognitive decline and dementia. I also think about things like movement, how things like music and dance can lead to the entrainment, the synchrony between our brains. I also look at the impact on the body, so the effect that the arts have on stress hormones, on immune function, even on the expression of our genes. I talk about all of these very deep-seated biological processes that we're just learning more and more about every month. And I also think about the influence on behavior, so how arts engagement can change our behavioral motivations, our self-control, our self-efficacy, our ability to change other behaviors in our lives that could benefit our health.
With reading, I know that there's the elements of mindful reading, so that relaxation. There's the executive functioning skills, because reading is such a process. You've got to put the letters together, and then you've got to remember what you just read, and then you've got to bring the whole story together. And so it's so wonderful for executive functioning. But then, of course, the whole therapeutic element, right? It's prompting and triggering other parts of your brain. It's almost like dreaming, right? You're bringing together pieces of yourself, really exploring some of the emotional triggers as well that art, reading, all of these things provoke. And that's obviously kickstarts the whole therapeutic process, the resonance and the connections that we feel with the narrative, the stories. So I assume obviously art is doing something very similar as well. When you really connect with a piece, or there's something that's resonating with you and you're able to explore it in a safe way, I can really appreciate all these other wonderful things that have similar effects. Like you said, cinema therapy and watching a film and the story, the journey it takes you on, and the emotional sort of pieces that you experience as a result of that. So I can see the benefits of that. I think what I love about your work is you've actually been able to measure some of these impacts. So I don't know if there's any really compelling pieces of evidence from your research that you might want to share or tell us about that might be quite thought-provoking for people or surprising even?
The work I find the most fascinating is looking at biological impact of the arts. My PhD was in psychoneuroimmunology, so it was trying to
Oh,
trace how
wow.
arts engagement affects immune function. Lots of the studies I did early on were looking at how arts relates to inflammation. And we actually see that people, when they engage in the arts, often have short-term boosts in immune activity straight after engaging. But over time, they can start to show profiles that are less inflammatory, so lower levels of inflammation in their bodies, which is linked
That's
in not
fascinating.
only to risk of physical illness, but also to risk of mental health conditions like depression, which has got inflammatory ties. But some of the work I'm finding really exciting at the moment is the work we're doing within my research group at UCL, where we're looking at how arts engagement relates to biological aging. And we're able to look at this in lots of different ways. We're able to look at the pattern of people's gene expression, and
Oh,
these are
wow.
called epigenetic clocks. So essentially, you can tell from the pattern of people's gene expression whether they're biologically older or younger than their chronological age. So, in other words, if someone is 50 years old, they might be biologically only 45 if they've had a lifestyle that's had lots of health promoting behaviors. And we're actually finding that people who are very regularly engaged in the arts actually have a younger epigenetic age, a younger biological age than people who are not engaged, even when we've taken account of their demographics, their socioeconomic position, and other aspects of their lifestyle and behaviors. And we're actually also seeing that when we look across multiple organ systems, the biomarkers within their organ systems also suggest that they are around 2 years younger biologically and have a slower pattern of aging over the following years. And some of my colleagues in Chile just published an amazing study where they found that amateur artists, musicians, and dancers actually have younger age in their brains as well. They have patterns of brain connectivity and brain clocks that suggest they are younger than their biological age.
Fascinating. Oh my goodness. That's the first I've ever come across something like that. So this is very prominent in artists and musicians and creators, I assume. Authors as
Very
well, I guess.
Yeah, essentially, we see this as well very much in professional artists and musicians too. Although,
Wow.
actually, I know that there can be challenges if you're a professional because then suddenly it might not be your stress buster, it might not be your release, it might be your job and therefore the thing that causes you stress and anxiety day to day. So there is often a little bit of a balance in professional artists. They do tend to show younger brains, but sometimes their mental health can suffer a bit more of a dip if they're
Yeah.
experiencing things like precarious working conditions.
So have you just seen this in creators, or is it also in people who passively enjoy the arts as well? Or you go
But
to cultural things, or go to the theatre, or go to a museum or an art gallery?
So we've
Would they
actually been
be?
seeing this from overall patterns of arts engagement. So,
Okay.
for example, the physiological organ age we found from people going to gigs or theatre performances or exhibitions or galleries or whatever. So actually, it looks like it's not just about participating. There can still be those benefits from broader kinds of arts engagement too.
Oh, wow. Okay. I think everyone needs a dose of culture and art every single day. But that's super interesting. And you mentioned the inflammation point, and I just wanted to pick up on that again. Is that because there's an interaction with cortisol, the stress hormone?
There seem to be multiple different biological systems and biological pathways affected by arts engagement. So, neuroendocrine stress response, like cortisol levels, is one of them.
Yeah.
Another one is more about autonomic nervous system. So, reductions in things like heart rate, blood pressure, cardiovascular wear and tear. Inflammation is another one that is related to cortisol levels, but it's not just part of that. It's part of a more complex process. And we also see other systems as well. So, people who have the most diverse and frequent patterns of arts engagement also have better cardiometabolic profiles. They've got lower levels of blood fats like triglycerides, and they've also got better management of blood sugars within their bodies.
That's fascinating. And what's the science behind that?
So the science from that has come from a mixture of clinical trials, but also what are known as molecular epidemiology studies, which is a bit of a mouthful, but it's
Yeah.
essentially studies that use very large samples of the population. They're called cohort studies, and they track people over years or decades of their lives, often from birth, collecting data on everything like blood samples, their clinical records, psychological questionnaires, brain imaging. And these cohort studies are the bedrock of health and medicine. It's how we understand the link between smoking and cancer, for example. But actually, lots of these cohort studies over the last few decades around the world have included questions on arts engagement. So the work that my team and I do at UCL is particularly focused on analysing these very large longitudinal data sets to understand how arts is related to longer term health outcomes years or decades later in people's lives.
Wow. Okay. So this is brilliant. This is giving me lots of excuses to engage in all sorts of things. I mean, I already do that as part of my work and because I'm so passionate about it, but it's just lovely to have a clearly scientific benefit. You must have studied like an effective dose, like a recommended daily dose, or what you would suggest as a minimum.
A bit like saying, what's the exact amount of exercise we should do all day? And the truth is, it depends which health outcome you're interested in, what you want to achieve. We can
Yeah.
experience health benefits from the arts within just a few minutes. Like if you're feeling very stressed and you take the time to engage in creative writing, for example, expressing that stress onto the page or through a story, then obviously that can help to reduce your stress in the moment. But then you wouldn't expect that 10-minute activity to have effect 20 years later unless you keep doing it regularly. So the question
Right.
about dose really links to, well, what's the health outcome that's of interest here? So we tend to see that people have the greatest long-term health benefits associated with their engagements if they're engaging on a regular basis, which is probably at least once a week, ideally even more than that, but repeatedly. So it means like trying to
Yeah.
carve out the time for the arts, not just as a kind of short-term January New Year's resolution that we then quit, but more as something that we just make sure we're weaving into our lives every day. In the same way, I think we've all got much better about weaving in our exercise alongside busy lives or trying to make sure that we're getting fruits and vegetables every day. I think it's about making that same
Yeah.
space, ideally every day, for the arts.
Yes. And I think what's wonderful about this is that it's something that's probably more motivating than any of the other pillars, right? Like it's just more exciting. It's just more accessible. It's something that you can do on your commute, but before bedtime, it's easier to engage with the arts in some shape or form. And so would you say as a dose of daily engagement?
I recommend in my book daily engagements because that way it's just
Yeah.
something that gets part of your routine, isn't it? And this can be
Yeah.
very simple things that can just be swaps in your life. Like last year, I swapped doom scrolling the news on my phone on the way to work to reading a novel. And that has been
Yeah.
such a simple change, but
Yeah.
actually one that I know really has a big influence on my mood at the start and end of every day.
Yeah.
Similarly, again, they sound trivial, but they're tiny changes that can add up, like not having an alarm in the morning, but having a piece of music that comes on to wake you up. That just sets your
Yeah.
mood a little bit
Amazing.
better at the start
Yeah.
of each
I love that
day.
idea. Yeah.
Instead of just meeting up with friends for drinks or food, like actually going to a gig or going to see something, that can just
Yeah.
be another way of like easily bringing a bit more creativity into your lives. And I also think there's a real value to try having novelty. So not being afraid to
Yeah.
try taster sessions of things, to try new arts experiences, to find something that you just really enjoy.
Yes, that level of that element of wonder and novelty, I love all of that. And I agree with the daily point. In my own book, I talk about the toothbrush test. But if you're not doing it every day, it's just not going to become embedded. For anything to really take hold, daily is the best way to go. And a lot of my listeners will be people who also listen to other podcasts. What do you think of podcasts? I assume they're a form of art in some ways, listening to storytelling,
It
or would
probably
you go,
depends what the content of your podcasts are. Just like with television, actually, I talk about
yeah,
this in the book as well, in that actually a lot of television is quite stress inducing. I talk
yeah,
about some
that
statistics
is
about very high proportions of television programs that have actually got violence as part of them. So I think it
yeah,
depends. If you're someone that's watching television that's a lot of violent shows, that's probably not going to be doing your brain wonders. And if you're listening to podcasts that are, for example, talking a lot about doom and gloom or stressful things or following current affairs, actually, we know that that is actually linked with increased symptoms of anxiety and depression. But if you're listening to more creative things, so you're watching arts documentaries or you're listening to podcasts that are about creativity and weaving in stories and that kind of thing, then that is much more of an artistic type of engagement.
yes. So something interesting that I picked up in my own work, which is when you're healing from trauma, sometimes actually watching like war films or reading war novels can, in a weird kind of way, be helpful for clients. And I don't know if you found that in your work, where some traumatic piece of art can be influential or helpful. That's certainly something that I've seen in my work. For example, the Greek tragedies, there's a place for them and a role for them in art
No,
and
there
music.
definitely is. And I'm certainly not implying that there aren't benefits to having the full range of emotions in
Yeah,
what we experience in the arts. And actually, there's something called the tragedy paradox, which is this paradox that even though we try and avoid suffering normally in our own personal lives, we do enjoy reading sad books and watching horror films and all these things that you
yeah,
would think would be bad for us.
yeah,
The thing is, if you do too much of that, it can get a bit much and a bit stressful. But actually, in moderation, it can be something that's actually really good for us because, yes, it elicits some emotions that can be quite deep and profound. But actually, our brains quite like this because we actually recognize that it's not a real life event that's provoked it. It is art that's provoked it. And that just gives a little bit of distance between us and the emotions that we're experiencing. And it actually allows our brains to contemplate those emotions a bit more, practice how to manage them. It actually helps the brain's ability to simulate how it would respond to unexpected or stressful things in the real world. And this is something called predictive coding. So this is something that can be a beneficial experience. I think it's more about identifying for ourselves when it's something that will be enjoyable or can help us with processing things because it might give us that authentic emotional connection with the experience versus when it might just be a little bit too much and we're starting to overwhelm ourselves with sad or stressful moments. Recently, my book club and we'd read a series of quite harrowing books. And actually, we all collectively said, you know what, we need a positive one for the next month because you recognize that actually you need that lift again.
I 100% agree. I think that it has to be bounded. But you're right, these stories and these pieces of art give us a safe space to explore some of these traumatic events that we might have experienced ourselves without necessarily having to relive them in ourselves, which sometimes we do need to get in touch with those difficult emotions and then release them in this way. So there's definitely a place for that. And I prescribe a lot of literature for different issues and emotions. I have a very emotional focused practice where stories are recommended based on what you're going through, whether it's grief or whether it's anger. What sort of role does social prescription play in the arts, and how do you go about prescribing different art activities? Obviously, it sounds like your book is a whole prescription in itself, but social prescription has become a bit of a trend. And how do you see it being implemented around the world at the moment?
I actually direct the National Centre for Social Prescribing Data and Analysis in the UK. So I'm working on this really closely. There are over 40 countries around the world now that have social prescribing schemes in some form or another. So we're seeing such a proliferation of this service. In the UK, what's been really exciting is seeing how this has grown since the national rollout began in 2019 of social prescribing. And so we're now seeing all around the UK that people can be referred to arts activities alongside other kinds of community support by GPs, by schools, by mental health services, by social workers. I think there's sometimes a challenge here, which is that the funding for social prescribing rollout in the UK hasn't gone alongside increased funding for the arts in communities. So it can be a bit postcode lottery as to whether there are great activities that you can be referred to or not. And it can also come down to the training and the skills and background of the individual link workers who are making those referrals, because sometimes they've got amazing knowledge of local areas. Sometimes they perhaps aren't as prepared to be able to deliver really personalized prescriptions. I think it's an amazing potential as a service, but I think that there are still some challenges in trying to make sure that it's as well designed as possible to benefit people as much as can be. But I have a lot of hope for it because I can give certain levels of advice and recommendations in the book, but everyone's an individual and arts are not a pill. So it's not one size fits all. So I think having bibliotherapists, arts therapists, social prescribers who can give that expert input is so important too.
And obviously, some of it may have to be self-funded, but it's great that there is some funding available as well.
Yes.
Like you said, through the NHS or through education systems. So I think that's brilliant. And I can only see it growing now. And also, I'm just curious from your perspective, given that this is a bookish podcast, what's been a book or a piece of literature that you could say has had a significant impact on your life, or that's been perhaps even life-changing?
I feel like I read so much, it changes all the time. I've got very young children and I've just started reading The Famous Five with them. And it was one of my favorite books in childhood, with The Famous Five, because I felt they're just this epitome of adventure, curiosity, friendship. I loved them. And now I was reading the first one to my eldest daughter and we got so into it. We were away on holiday. While she was asleep, I kept reading the next ones in the series on my own because I was just enjoying it so much, that escapism from it.
I know there's something about children's literature that I think we can all relate to, and this is why picture books are so popular, even with adults. There's so much meaning behind children's literature and fairy tales as well, going back to the story,
Yes.
things like abandonment and Hansel and Gretel, or Little Red Riding Hood wanting to go down the forest path even when she was told not to. There's so much in these tales that are playing with our subconscious mind and, as you said, influencing the brain. So that's fantastic to hear. I think my book was Little Women. I read that with my daughter, and then we watched the film. I think that whole sense of sharing with our children is also another ball game in itself. Kids sort of healing, revisiting our past, and there's something in there that we're trying to probably work through as well sometimes. That's why I often recommend rereading books, because there might be something there that we're still working on, which is wonderful. It's been so lovely to talk to you today and find out a bit more about The Art Cure, and I'm so excited to read it myself. I'll definitely be getting a copy when it's out tomorrow. And for people who might be interested in perhaps seeing you live or maybe engaging with you further, where should they start? I assume you're on all the social media channels.
I'm actually not on any social media, but it's a decision I'm actually perfectly happy with, I'll be honest.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Gives me more time for creativity. But you can find me on my research group's website, which is sbbresearch.org/artcure, where we've got lists of all of the events that are coming up over the next year and also other opportunities to engage relating to the book.
Okay, so these are all in the UK?
Some are in the UK, some are abroad, some are online. So there are lots of different opportunities.
And I assume the book is out everywhere, like across the Commonwealth.
Yes, it comes out in the US on the 3rd of February, so very soon. And then there are several translations as well. And one other thing I'm very excited about is I'm speaking at all of the big literary festivals around the UK this year. So things like Hay on Wye and Guernsey and Faversham. So it'll be lovely to meet up with lots of other book enthusiasts at those as well.
Yeah, I love literary festivals. They're always the best. There's nothing like engaging with readers in person. I think there's a real sense of community, sense of shared connection and sharing of real interests like the arts and their amazing power. And I love talking to people about bibliotherapy. So for me, a live event always trumps everything else. Okay, so I will share that link in the show notes after our conversation so that people can go to it and visit it for more details. It's been so wonderful to chat today, Daisy. I really appreciate you coming on, and I wish you all the best of luck with the book. It sounds like it's doing so well, and I'm sure it's going to benefit tons of readers. Thank you for writing it and telling your story today. It's been brilliant.
Thank you so much, and happy reading.
Thanks, Daisy.
Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed the show. And if you'd like to sign up to our online courses or try a personalised book prescription or bibliotherapy session, you can do so following the links in the show notes. And as always, I love hearing from listeners, so don't hesitate to drop me an email at bidgel@booktherapy.io.